Hey everybody, it's EJ from eyedesyn.com, and today we're going to be pushing the limits of the Sketch and Toon Cel Shader, and we're going to be going way beyond just your typical two-tone cel shading that you typically see in a lot of animations these days. And we're going to create some really cool, fun, stylized cel shading, really some cool cartoony styles using the Cel Shader. We're going to cover a little bit of some very easy XPresso that's really going to help speed up your workflow. And we're going to have some fun with my favorite deformer, the Jiggle Deformer, at the very end of this tutorial. So be sure to stay tuned to that. So let's push the limits of the Sketch and Toon Cel Shader. All right, so this is, let's just call him Blink. Link's little brother who maybe had way too much coffee. But today we're going to be going into how you can create cool cartoon looks and really push the Sketch and Toon Cel Shader a little bit further than your typical cel shading that you see a lot these days. So this is just your standard two-tone cel shading, but I'm going to show a few other ways you can get a little bit more stylized, maybe go tritone, get some more cool stylized shades in there, and even how to get some cool noisy, grainy type of renders as well. So let's just start just very basic. So let me just go into my interactive render region here so I can actually see what my render is going to look like, and just make sure your little triangle here is set to the top, because this just controls the quality. You bring that all the way up. You can also right click on this little triangle to go to alpha mode, so you can just see your gray grid coordinate grid just back there too if you want. So here is what I got so far, and I have three materials that are making up my Blink, my little Blink character here, and he's actually even animated, and he's super happy. He wants some more coffee. Someone gave him some ice cream and a puppy. He's just so excited. So I'm going to actually cover how I animated his hair and stuff at the end of this tutorial, so stay tuned for that. But just some very basic materials. So the main key to creating cool 2D style effects in Cinema 4D is to just live and play in this luminance texture. If you're not familiar with luminance or just 3D in general, so typically when you create a new material, it comes equipped with both its actually let me just create a new material just from the get-go. So I just created a new material by double clicking in my material manager down here, and you're going to see that what happens is we have a color channel that's set to like a quarter gray, something like that, and then we have a specular channel here as well, and specular is basically just like a fake reflection, right? So that's the two things that happen when you create a new material. But when you want to create 2D style things in 2D style shading, you don't want any of this diffuse. And diffuse is basically the shading that happens with lighting in your scene. So we have this gradient that is giving the illusion of this sphere or this circle being a sphere, because we have this nice gradation. We can see where the light's coming from and illuminating our object here. But if we turn off the color and we turn off the specular and we just turn on the luminance here, we're actually going to lose all that diffuse shading, and we're going to get a flat circle. So we have no more sphere anymore. So let's just go ahead and go back into our skin texture here. And again, I'll turn off the color and the reflectance and turn on the luminance. And again, we have this flat texture here. But what is great about cel shading is we can reintroduce some of that shading, some of that lighting, but it's very limited to just, say, a couple of shades of color. So to do this, to get nice cel shading, you can kind of go beyond just the flat look. And actually, this looks pretty good in itself. If you're just going to do a very flat, stylized type of animation, you still get all this nice parallaxing and stuff of his head turning and all that good stuff, just by using this flat luminance color. So that's just your bare bones, very basic, just dipping your toe in the pool of 2D in Cinema 4D, just using luminance. But where the fun really starts is when we start using some of the tools in the Sketch and Toon module. Let me just move this window up here, go all the way down to Sketch and Toon. Now Sketch and Toon's only included if you have the Cinema 4D version Studio or Visualize. So if you don't have those two, I actually have other tutorials where you can actually try to recreate this cel shader that is included in Sketch and Toon. I'll link it to this video right now, right about now. And so Cel Shader right here in Sketch and Toon. I'm going to load that up, and what's going to happen is we have this gradient pop up. And if we click on the Cel Shader button, we're going to see what's actually happening here. So let me just go back to frame 0, and two things are happening. Number one, we have this gradient that has just 3 color chips or 3 tones of this blue. So we have light blue, this medium blue, and this little bit darker blue. And that's applied to our model. Now the light source, because you need a light source to be able to determine where these colors are mapped to, and the light source is actually the camera at this point. So the light source is coming straight from our camera view that we're in right now. So what we can do with this diffuse gradient in the Cel Shader is move these color chips around, and basically this is going to change how these colors are mapped to the contour or along the surface of our object. So you can see as I move color chips more to the left, more of that color is going to be present on our objects. And the converse is if we move the color chips to the right, you're going to see less and less of that object, or less and less of that color. So you can see as I move this lighter blue color chip all the way to the right, you can see we're seeing less and less of that mapped onto our object. So that's just very, very basic stuff. So what I can do is if I want to actually use a light as the light source. So you can see in my scene, I actually have a light down here, and it's just your standard Omni light. And the most important thing about using lights with Cel Shader is that you want to have a ray traced hard shadow, because of course we're dealing with 2D. You don't want a soft shadow when everything else in your scene is just nice sharp edges. So using this ray trace hard shadow is going to give you a nice sharp hard shadow there. So we can only utilize that in the shadows and all that stuff when we actually turn on lights. And what that's going to do is it's going to utilize the light source in your scene, or any light. So right now I just have this one light. If you have multiple lights, it'll use all those lights in your scene. Or you can just choose a light. So if you have many lights in your scene, but you only want one light to actually drive the texture or the cel shading on one material, this is nice for very object level control. You can just drag and drop a light in there, and you can exclude it, or you can just include that. So that's kind of important. So I'll just delete that. And so now we're using that light source. And again, we have the hard shadow on there, so we can actually go ahead and turn on shadows in our Cel Shader to recognize the shadows. So now you can see that the hair is casting this really nice shadow on there. But the one way I like to work in using the Cel Shader is, instead of choosing all the different shades of color that we want to use, and we could totally do that and just change this to a more of a skin tone. Maybe he's been tanning for too long with that kind of orange skin there. But what I like to do to be able to actually control the cel shading for all of the objects in my scene, or all the materials in my scene actually, is to do a little workflow hack. And that is to, instead of using color chips in here, so say I just want to do a two-tone cel shading for right now. If you want to get more stylized, so if you want your darker shade to be a bluish thing to get some really cool color combinations and stuff like that, you could totally do that. Just use these color chips and then just, work individually and adding cel shaders to the luminance on these textures as well. But what I like to do to kind of speed up my workflow is to just use grayscale values in the cel shader chips here. Now what this is going to do is make your character into a ghost, basically. But what we can do is, when we go back into Luminance, we can go into this mix mode, and instead of normal, we can actually multiply this cel shader on top of our actual color here that's in our Luminance channel. So just like in Photoshop or After Effects, we have these blending modes. And what I'll do is I'll just choose multiply. And then what will happen is this Cel Shader Gradient will multiply on top of this color, and you'll get this nice two-tone cel shading on top of our little object here, or our face, using this, this tan skin texture. So what I can do to actually have all the changes and apply this cel shader to these other objects versus having to like manually copy and paste this into each one. But then if I change something here, it won't update there. I'd actually have to go into this material as well and then adjust the shading and the color chips in here. To prevent all of that and to be able to control our cel shading in here, to actually control the cel shading on these two other materials in our scene, we're gonna use what is equivalent to the pick whip in After Effects. So if you're used to working in After Effects, the pick whip, you can have one thing drive another thing. So like the position, you can have that drive multiple positions on other objects. This is basically what we're going to be doing here. And the pick whip equivalent in Cinema 4D is called set driver, set driven. So what you need to do to initiate this is just whatever you want to have be driven by one object or one parameter to affect another parameter, is you need to right click on the object or on the parameter you want to be the main parent or that main driver, and just go to expressions and set driver. So basically what this is going to do is whatever happens in this texture field, I want this to drive something else. And what that something else is are these two other texture fields in this Luminance channel. So what I'll do is I'll just right click the same thing, right click the texture word here, go to expressions again, and then just say set driven. And then what's going to happen is you can see automatically we have that cel shading from our original material here on the skin, and it's now applied to our two other materials. And the great part is I already had the mix mode set to multiply, so you can just do that manually if you want as well. So I'll just set that to multiply. So this will multiply on top of this color here. And the great part about this is this is now linked. No puns intended. This is a link. So what happens is it creates a null with a XPresso tag on it. Now, XPresso could be kind of daunting to some people, but it's really, really easy to use the set driver, set driven, and have XPresso just do all of the expression work in the background. So XPresso is the equivalent of expressions in After Effects. And it's very, very simple stuff. So basically you can see what's happening is the skin texture, so that texture that we selected, is linked to the orange texture in the luminance as well. So you can just see this is a very simple setup, but it's doing it all behind the scenes. So you don't even have to worry about what's going on there. But set driver, set driven, I have a tutorial all about other really useful workflow hacks that you can use and really speed up your workflow using set driver, set driven. I'll link to that right now as well. But now you can see that I can actually move this color chip around. It's going to affect and change and drive the other cel shader shaders in the other materials. So this is really easy to be able to modify and try to see what kind of looks look good, what kind of look that you're going for, and not have to keep updating other materials as well. So this is really going to speed up your cel shader workflow. So this is your basic two-tone cel shading. So the cool thing about cel shading is it's all based on a gradient, right? But we're not just limited to just two tones. We can also add like a third color chip here and just make that a little bit darker. And we have this tritone thing going on. Very easy, simple stuff. And again, this is all linked by that set driver, set driven. So it's also being applied to the rest of the materials on our object. But the cool thing is we can actually twirl down this diffuse gradient here. And the main way this is really creating a cool cel shading look is that there's no interpolation between these gradient colors. So it's just from gray straight to this mid gray, straight to white. There's no smoothing or anything in there, and that's creating this cool cartoon look. But say you want to try to create maybe a different kind of cartoon style, or maybe comic book, like new comic books these days have really cool stylized cartoon shading. So what we can do to try to emulate that kind of style is to change the interpolation from none to smooth not. And what that's going to do is create some smoothing between all of our color chips, and it's giving you a little bit more of that 3D depth. You can definitely sense more of the 3D geometry making up this object, but it's very stylized. It still looks fairly flat. So what we can do is we can have full flexibility of like dragging this little diamond here and having this gradient be very sharp and then smooth from this darker color all the way to this gray color. And then I can actually move this white color chip all the way to the right, and we can get more smoothing. And again, I can adjust this color chip here as well. So we can get some really interesting looks, because you can see that I have a sharp interpolation between this darker shade, and then it kind of smooths out from that middle gray to white. And again, we can adjust this very easily. So again, this is super useful for creating and pushing the cel shader beyond just that typical two-tone cel shading that you typically see in a lot of people's work, my work included. But this is just a way to get more stylized. So you can add more color chips to your heart's extent if you want to do that. So next I'm going to cover Specular, and this will actually turn on specular highlights in our cel shader, and you'll see that pop up right here. We have a few gradient knots. But the one thing you're going to notice is that because we're using this workflow where we have all of these cel shaders linked and the cel shading is actually multiplied on top of a color, all of our specular highlights are kind of washed out and kind of faint. And that's just due to that blending mode. So what I like to do when utilizing this workflow is to just create a whole new material. And this will just be the specular highlight. And what I'm going to do is turn on the luminance, just keep it pure white, and then go into the alpha channel, turn this on, and apply a cel shader in here. So let's just go ahead and load this up and apply this to some of the hair objects here. So we got the big piece there, the sideburn, and then the right hair piece. So you can see that we have a little bit of that orange popping through here. But as we know, alphas work with black and white mattes in this instance. So we're going to go ahead, and instead of just using blues, I'm just going to choose one black chip and one white chip. And you're going to see that now we're only seeing the part of the of this white luminance where we have this gradient knot. And again, this is we just loaded up a brand new cel shader, so the default light source is camera. I can go ahead and turn on lights, and you can see that now we have these nice bright highlights on our object, which is really nice. So and again, we can control how thin that specular highlight is based on this diffuse knot. And the nicest thing about this is, remember, we have this light exclusion, so we can actually choose a light to just drive the specular. So if we want some really nice specular hits right on the edges of our hair, we can go ahead and do that. So what I'll do is, I got my main light here. I'll just duplicate this, name this my specular light. And for this, I don't even need the shadows on, so I'll just change that to none. And what I'll say is, okay, this specular cel shader, I just want to use or include the specular light in here. And then conversely, I'll go into my other cel shader and say exclude this specular light from affecting any of these other materials. So that one specular material, or the one specular light, will just affect this specular material. So now what I can do is just independently move this one light, and it's just going to control the specular highlights, which is really nice. So now we got this really nice specular hit on the hair that's looking really good. And again, we can get full control over how that specular looks. And we can even go back into our cel shader here and say maybe we want a little bit more more of that light hit to happen. But you can see this is looking kind of, you know, anime-ish, where you just have this nice little specular light hit on the top of the object, which is really nice. One thing I want to cover as well is the back facing here. So back facing means, so right by default, this gradient, this diffuse gradient is just being applied to the front of this object. But if you turn on back facing, this will actually apply this gradient to the front and the back of this material or of this object. So I can actually make this fairly thin, and you can see the difference between back facing and no back facing is that actually makes it smaller because it's not applied through the back and the front of this object. And what we're going to do is actually see this a lot more prominently if I go ahead and say I want to go into my skin cel shading here, go to my skin cel shader, and maybe I want to make this darker so we have some really nice contrast. And you're going to see how much of that darker color is on this. If I turn on back facing, you're going to see even less of it, and I'm going to have to actually move these gradient knots a little bit more to the right for even that darker shade to show up, because you can see that this gradient's not just being applied to the front, but also the back of my object. So keep that in mind when you're dealing with cel shading. If you have a gradient knot all the way to the left and you're still seeing way too much of that shade, turn on back facing and that will kind of solve things. So I'll just turn this off for now. One other cool thing I like to do is to push this even further. We can utilize the bump channel and add a little bit of grain. So what I'm going to do is go into the bump channel here on my skin texture, just enable it, and then I'm going to go to texture and I'm just going to grab a noise shader here. And what I'm going to do is just make this noise shader a little bit smaller because that noise is a little bit too big. And then I'll add a little bit of contrast here. And you're going to notice that the bump is not affecting anything at all. It's not affecting our cel shader. Well, what's going on? To have the bump channel affect the cel shader, we actually need to go one step further in our cel shader and actually turn on use bump. And what's going to happen is you can see that now he looks like a pimple face or something like that. Not quite sure what's going on there. But all we need to do, but we can see that the bump channel is doing something now with that use bump, right? So we can go into our bump channel, and the one thing I notice is that that global scale needs to come down way a little bit further. And now he looks like he has stubble all over his face. But we get this nice little, this really nice grain happening though. To actually control how much of this bump is going across his, the geometry here, all we have to do is adjust the strength. And you'll see that as I bring the strength down, that bump will be more confined to the actual like darker shades of this object. So you're going to see it less in the lighter spots and more in the darker spots. And you can see that even better here. And it just adds a really nice grainy type of look. And you see this kind of style a lot in infographics and a lot of After Effects 2D animations. So you can do that very simply here as well. And again, the great part about making things in 3D, if you need to turn a head, you don't need some complex head rig or expressions. You just, you literally rotate the head. And everything turns and all that good stuff. No crazy expressions. So again, we can use that set driver, set driven workflow to have this texture field on our skin texture drive the bump channel or the bump texture field on our other materials here. So I'll turn on bump and I'll right click and just say set driven. And again, you can now see that nice shading on our other objects as well. And we can go ahead and adjust the strength on each of these, maybe 7 on that. We can also link the strength on this as well. So I can just right click on this, expression, set driver. And then on the strength on the other two textures, just say set driven. And boom, we have everything being controlled by the strength slider on our skin texture here. So as I adjust this, it's controlling everything else and looking really nice, looking really good. Cool. So just some really nice ways you can push the cel shader a little bit further. And again, just to go back to all of those different looks, and just see the difference. So here's what we just made, right? And there's like a more stylized tritone gradient, again with more smoothing interpolation between those gradient knots. Here's one with just a two-tone and messing around with the interpolation between each color. And then we have just your typical two-tone cel shading, very reminiscent of that new Link video game and all that good stuff. So that was, I believe that's just two-tone cel shading too. So the cel shader can really do a lot if you push it real good. Hey-o. And again, we can see our other expressions that popped up here, all controlling the different things. You can kind of get a good sense, and again, you don't even need to touch that. That's all happening in the background, just like using pick whip expressions in After Effects. So now that we've gone through all those looks, let's go ahead and I'm gonna go and we're gonna have a little bonus section on how I animated the hair here to have that nice little jiggle. We're gonna have a bonus jiggle added to this. So what I'm gonna do first is I'm just gonna get out of let's keep interactive render region on. And I'm just gonna go ahead and just select all these objects that have the Jiggle Deformer on it already. So all of my little hair pieces here. And what I'm going to do is just go ahead and I want to store this as a selection. So I don't want to have to go and manually select all these objects again and again. So what I'll do is do a very helpful thing and create a selection object. And what a selection object is going to do, if I just go to select, create selection object, is it's going to allow me to restore that selection that I just had by simply double clicking on this little icon here. And then it just automatically selects all those objects again. So very, very super useful workflow enhancement there using the selection object. And what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and delete all the jiggles here. Delete all of the jiggles. But then what I'll do is just make sure I have those objects back again. So these are the ones I need to apply the jiggle to. And I'm also going to delete the wind object there because that'll come in handy later. So here we go. These are the objects I need to apply the Jiggle Deformer to. So I'll go and just apply, get the Jiggle Deformer here. And let's see, what were those ones again? So this is even good as a reference too. So I can just say, okay, the hat, I'll just go ahead and bring the hat down there. And then I can actually lock this as well. So I can lock this in my view so I can keep looking and referencing this. So the Jiggle Deformer is on the hat. It's on the sideburn, both sideburns. It's also on the hair and the hair piece R. So it's also helpful to actually name your things somewhat coherently so you know what each thing is doing. But you can see that everything has some really nice jiggle going on right now. Just very nice jiggly, but we actually need to have sort of like an anchor point because you can see specifically in the hat here that it's just jiggling all over the place, and we actually need to adjust it so the base of the hat is not jiggling so much, and similar things with like the sideburns here as well. So the way to do that, and I can actually unlock my selection object here so I can actually select things like let's see, what's the right hair piece? So this is the hair piece. Let's actually just deal with the hat. So I got my Jiggle Deformer here. And what I'm going to do is utilize a fall off. And what the fall off is going to do, it's going to be very similar to fall offs in effectors, where if you change this fall off shape from, say, infinite to, let's just say, like a sphere, and then just position this, and let's go into our 4-up view by hitting this little corner button here. And what I'm going to do is just make this sphere big enough that it is encompassing the base of the hat. So what this is going to do is say only jiggle everything inside of this circle. But actually, we don't want that. We actually want the inverse of that. So what we'll do is just invert that. And what that'll do then is anything inside this circle will not have jiggle, and everything outside will have jiggle. So that's kind of what we want. We want this, the base of the hat, to not have so much jiggle, and everything outside here to have a little bit of jiggle. And we could have used a linear fall off as well, but let's just see how this looks now. So you can see there's still not enough. You can see it, especially in our right view. We don't have enough width on this, and let's actually just make this sphere a little bit bigger. And actually, you know what, let's just go ahead and use a linear instead, because this will be a lot more easy to visually see here. So let's go ahead and instead of orientation -Z, I'll choose +X, and now you can see linearly our fall off here, and we can just rotate this as well. So let's just uncheck invert, and let's just see what happens now. So let's just move this up a little bit. So we want the base of the cap to not jiggle, and then everything else have a little bit of jiggle. And what I'll do as well is you can see that we have this little fall off here, and this middle red plane here. So basically we're going from 100% strength to, or 0% strength to 100, and then it's 100 all the way on. So if we want a smoother interpolation, so 0 to all the way to 100, we can do that by cranking up the fall off 100%. And let's see what we got here. So now you can see, actually, this is facing the wrong way because the tip of our cap is actually the anchor and everything else is jiggling. So we can do one of two things. We can invert, or we can just change the orientation from +X to -X. And now you can see that now the base of the cap has very little jiggle, or 0% jiggle, and then we have this ramp, this gradient ramp almost of strength from 0 all the way to 100. So you can see that there, and we can even shrink this too, so we can have this jiggling a little bit more. And then we can start messing around with the actual jiggle options here, so we can add stiffness. We can add a little bit more drag, so it's a lot more friction add there. And see how this looks. So now you can see it looks like it's underwater almost because we have so much drag here. You can kind of mess around with this stuff. And structural, it's almost like if your object was made up of tiny, tiny springs, the lower the structural value, the more those springs will oscillate. And then the higher value of structure, those springs will stop oscillating faster. So that just is another thing you can mess around with as well. And then just your overall strength, right? So let's just do this again. That was a little bit confusing because I did a few different things. Let's just go ahead and go to the sideburns here. And I'll select both these sideburns. And just like we did previously, we're just going to use a linear fall off. And we want this to face in the +Y. And again, I'll just crank up the fall off here. And then I can just adjust the height of this as well. So I'll just move the right sideburn. I believe that's the right sideburn. Actually, they're both right sideburns. See, always helps to name things correctly because these are both named right. I have no idea, but it should be okay. We're gonna survive here. Let's go ahead and see if we have this correctly. So let's just move our Jiggle Deformers down a little bit here. So what should happen is the anchor should be, or the less jiggle should be applied to the top here. Let's just move this down a little bit more so it's a little bit more pronounced. You can definitely see that the top of the sideburn is not moving and the bottom of the sideburn is definitely having all that jiggle. And we can definitely see this a lot more if we make this even shorter. And you can definitely see that. But you want a little bit of smoothing between where it jiggles and where it doesn't. So I think that's looking pretty good. And again, we can go into this jiggle options here, adjust the stiffness, adjust the drag, and the structural. You can see if I bring the structural way down, you can see it's a lot more springy, especially if I bring the stiffness down as well. We just have some weird stuff happening there. But you definitely see that there's a lot more geometry deformation. So I'm just going to keep the structural fairly high and the stiffness high as well because we don't want that actually intersecting with the face. It's not a good thing. But there we go. And then, we just do the same exact thing with the top of the hair here. We'll just use a different, we'll just use linear again. And we can even just rotate this in the right direction. Bring the fall off all the way up. And again, you can see by the arrow that we're actually facing the wrong direction because it's actually going from 100% strength to 0. And we'll just scale this down here. And actually, that's the opposite way. Let's do a -Z. And now that's the ticket. Now it's facing in the right direction. We have more of the anchor happening here. Let's just move this out so we can see. So you can see the 0% strength to 100% strength. And there we go. So that's basically how I created the jiggliness there. One cool thing you can do with Jiggle Deformers is it has this really cool Forces tab. And what you can do is use particle forces up in the Simulate menu here. We can use particle forces. And the thing I added to have just his hair just gracefully blowing in the wind is just to add a wind object here. And then I can just move this around and just say which way I want his hair to blow. And you can see this little arrow right here. I'll just have the wind blow from left to right. And let's just make sure this is affecting it. And it's not affecting the jiggle because we actually need to go into all of our jiggles. And I can get all those jiggles by just going to my search field here by clicking the little magnifying glass, selecting all of my jiggles here, and getting out of that. And I have all my jiggles selected still, and I'll just drag and drop that wind into my forces field, and that should now recognize the wind. And you can see a slight movement by the wind, but if I just turn up the wind speed, you can definitely tell there's a lot of wind going on there. We can add some turbulence here as well to have all this stuff move. Let's just crank this up fairly high. Now you can really see the wind gracefully wafting his hair, Link's hair in the breeze. And no keyframes added, which is really cool. Now his hair is about to fly off, so that's a little bit too high. Oh god, no. No. And sometimes when that happens, just don't do that high. Don't type in 8,000 instead of 80. Don't do that. Okay, everything's good. We're back to normal. All right, so you can see by being just a little bit creative with how you manipulate the gradient knots in the Cel Shader, you can create some really cool stylized cartoony looks. And then go even further and introduce some bump into your Cel Shader, create some grainy cel shading as well. So there's a lot there. And we also learned how to use the very basic XPresso of set driven or set driver, set driven, and how you can really improve your workflow in your day-to-day work. So hopefully that's very helpful to you. And then we finished up by utilizing one of my favorite deformers, the Jiggle Deformer, and use a little bit of particle objects as well, like the wind deformer, to actually animate some stuff like hair, and without any extra keyframes. So there's a lot in this tutorial. If you have any questions about anything I covered, be sure to post them in the comments section. I'll try to get to them as fast as I can. And if you create anything using any of the techniques that I showed off in this tutorial, please share it with me on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebooks, on the MySpaces, on your MyFaces, all that good stuff. I'd love to see what you're making out there. And if you like this tutorial, please hit the like button. I'd really appreciate that. And as always, really appreciate all of you out there watching this tutorial. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye, everybody. I did it again.